I'm going to be reading again from my book, Mind and Evolution, as assessed through reviews of major texts. The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind by Julian Jaynes, 1976. After Darwin's Origin of Species, which I read as a teenager, Jaynes is the book that's made the greatest impact on me. Darwin's book told me where human nature came from, not from God, it evolved. Jaynes' book told me what human nature is, what had to evolve for it to exist, consciousness, for example. What Jaynes told me about consciousness meant Darwin was wrong. The mechanism Darwin proposed for how evolution worked couldn't account for consciousness, not as we experience it, not as Jaynes described it. I regard Jaynes' book as the most important book about evolution next to Darwin's. For a summary of his approach, I quote from Wikipedia, in turn quoting from a talk Jaynes gave in 1972 at Cornell University. Quote, "For if consciousness is based on language, then it follows that only humans are conscious, and that we became so at some historical epoch after language was evolved." This took Jaynes directly into the earliest writings of mankind to see if we can find any hints as to when this important invention of consciousness might have occurred. Jaynes trained as an experimental scientist, psychologist, and clinician, accepting there was nothing mystical about consciousness. It's a product of brain function. But following that, after analyzing all our concepts of it, Jaynes concludes that we know nothing about it. All the terms we use for describing consciousness are no more than metaphors. Together, they add up to an overall metaphor representing consciousness as a container centered on our heads, a space in which we carry all our thoughts and feelings. When civilization arose, humans were no more conscious than other animals, Jaynes supposes. Then, one by one, those terms were developed and merged to form that container metaphor, and as they did, they drove changes in our brains. Because the brain supports our mental faculties, as the brain changes, consciousness can change too, but that process can operate in reverse, Jaynes supposes. Over historical time, changes in consciousness can drive changes to the brain. If history over the past 5,000 years had been different, we'd have ended up with different brains as well as with different terms for describing consciousness, a different concept for it, and our experience of it would be different. Consciousness is a construction of both brain function and culture. So consciousness isn't something we can think about in an abstract way, outside those historical changes, not yet anyway. To understand it today, we can do no better than to trace how the terms we use to describe it arose and merge to create how we experience our own consciousness. The great genius of Jaynes' book is his tracing in detail, through art and written records, how those terms arose, and so the origin of what consciousness means to us. In pursuit of that data, he ventured far afield beyond his specialties in psychology and neuroscience into anthropology, analysis of ancient texts, dream analysis, hypnosis, and wherever else the muses led him. Jaynes begins his account in the heyday of the great cities of the ancient world. Drawing on new science as of the time he was writing, he calls the human mind bicameral. He means first that each hemisphere of the brain supported its own mind, each mind making its distinctive contributions to human decision-making. Crudely, the left contributes reason, mastery of speech, and decision-making. The right contributes intuition, astuteness, and a limited capacity for speech. This distinction has had a rocky history since Jaynes wrote, but Wikipedia tells me the idea has, in essence, survived. By bicameral, Jaynes means also that the two hemispheres could not yet communicate directly with one another. The right could at that time communicate with the left only by actually speaking out loud for the left to hear it, which the left experienced as someone else talking. What had to happen to make the organization of huge cities possible, Jaynes claims, was rulers' left brains being provided with a surrogate for that someone else, that the ruler could converse with as a way of inducing his more astute right mind to advise him. This surrogate typically took the form of a statue with hypnotically large, bejeweled eyes. Jaynes then supposes that the city's other residents organized themselves in hierarchies through which the ruler's decisions were passed down. No one experienced consciousness as we do today. For that to happen, the bicameral mind had to break down, which, in the course of a dozen centuries, it did. As the two minds adjusted so as to communicate directly, the brain restructured itself. The apparatus of modern consciousness was created, a single mind able to combine the left's greater capacity for speech with the right's greater intuitive wisdom or pattern recognition. All that is then needed is for this new mind to learn how to think. And Jaynes goes on to quote original ancient writings that show us that process occurring in exquisite detail, including all the excruciating pain our ancestors had to experience in the process. Solon, among the ancient Greeks, ruler of Athens, he identifies as experiencing his two minds fully unified about, 500 BC? In the Old Testament, he identifies a book recording as a prophet's 100% bicameral prophetic speech from around 700 BC. By 200 BC, a book of writings by a suave modern consciousness. And he comes up with quotations representing all the steps in between. For me, Jaynes' extensive reinterpretation of ancient Greek writings and the Old Testament provide powerful evidence for his argument. Along the way, he tells us how people desperate to bring back the bicameral voices or find replacements for them created organized religions, angels to carry messages to the now distant gods, omens, oracles, various kinds of sorcery and fortune-telling, possession by spirits, demons, and so on, right up to the present. It's thrilling reading, accounting rationally for a wealth of mental phenomena we'd previously dismissed as archaic and primitive or spiritual. Jaynes ends the book speaking as a clinician, seeing the bicameral mind represented in our time by such conditions as schizophrenia and Tourette syndrome. Usually, a consciousness is induced in a child by its learning of language. As an illustration of how language aids consciousness, he says, With the prodding of Heraclitus in the 6th century BC, we invent new words, or really modifications of old words, to name processes or symbolize actions over time by adding the suffix sis, S-I-S, and so be conscious of them. Words in Greek like gnosis, a knowing, genesis, a beginning, emphasis, a showing in, analysis, a loosening up, or particularly phronesis, which is variously translated as intellection, thinking, understanding, or consciousness. The phrase self-conscious, I've read, does not appear in English until the 1820s, borrowed from the German. Before that, were we self-conscious or only conscious? Jaynes' book begins with the best account I've come across of what consciousness is. He goes on to provide us with a shortcut guide to the invention of intellect and consciousness, painted in both the broadest of strokes and in critical detail. His interest lies in using this wisdom both to understand ourselves and in clinical practice to help others. His thoughts on the implications of consciousness for evolution he confines to his introduction. Is this consciousness, it asks, this enormous influence of ideas, principles, beliefs over our lives and actions, really derivable from animal behavior? Alone of species, all alone? We try to understand ourselves and the world. The chasm between us and other animals is awesome. The emotional lives of men and of other animals are indeed marvelously similar, but to focus on the similarity unduly is to forget that such a chasm exists at all. The intellectual life of man, his culture and history and religion and science, is different from anything else we know of in the universe. That is fact. It is as if all life evolved to a certain point and then in ourselves turned at right angles and simply exploded in a different direction. Appreciation of this discontinuity between the apes and speaking, civilized, ethical, intellectual men has led many scientists back to a metaphysical view. The interiority of consciousness just could not in any sense be evolved by natural selection among mere assemblages of molecules and cells. There had to be more to human evolution than mere matter, chance, and survival. Something must be added to this closed system to account for something so different as consciousness. Such thinking began with the beginning of modern evolutionary theory, particularly in the work of Alfred Russel Wallace, co-discoverer of the theory of natural selection. Following their twin announcement of the theory in 1858, both Darwin and Wallace struggled with the serpentine problem of human evolution and its encoiling difficulty of consciousness. But where Darwin clouded the problem with his own naivete, seeing only continuity in evolution, Wallace could not do so. The discontinuities were terrifying and absolute. Man's conscious faculties, particularly, could not possibly have been developed by means of the same laws which have determined the progressive development of the organic world in general and also of man's physical organism. Wallace felt the evidence showed that some metaphysical force had directed evolution at three different points: the evolution of life, the beginning of consciousness, and the beginning of civilized culture. In reaction to this metaphysical speculations, there grew up throughout this earlier period of evolutionary thinking an increasingly materialist view. It was a position more consistent with straight natural selection. It even had inherent in it that acrid pessimism that is sometimes curiously associated with the really hard sciences. This doctrine assures us that consciousness does nothing at all, and in fact can do nothing. Many tough-minded experimentalists still agree with Herbert Spencer that such a downgrading of consciousness is the only view that is consistent with straight evolutionary theory. Animals are evolved, nervous systems and their mechanical reflexes increase in complexity. When some unspecified degree of nervous complexity is reached, consciousness appears, and so begins its futile course as a helpless spectator of cosmic events. What we do is completely controlled by the wiring diagram of the brain and its reflexes to external stimuli. Consciousness is no more than the heat given off by the wires, a mere epiphenomenon. Consciousness is the shadow that loyally walks step by step beside the pedestrian, but is quite unable to influence his journey. In response, William Jaynes challenged this conscious automaton theory. It is just plain inconceivable that consciousness should have nothing to do with the business which it so faithfully attends. If consciousness is the mere impotent shadow of actions, why is it most intent when action is most hesitant? And why are we least conscious when doing something most habitual? Certainly the seesawing relationship between consciousness and actions is something that any theory of consciousness must explain. And so must any theory of evolution too. Jaynes' critique of evolutionary theory, his merging of science and the humanities, and his readings of ancient documents are the inspiration behind my reviews. If the brain can be reshaped by conscious experiences acting over historical time, how must that brain have evolved? By a purely physical process? If that process can transact in terms of consciousness, might it have evolved something like consciousness itself? Tackling that question involves the study of both evolution and consciousness, supplementing the methods of the sciences with those of the humanities, and following our studies wherever they lead. I see Jaynes as providing us with the playbook. Jaynes' book was rumored to be the Book of the Month Club's all-time non-fiction bestseller at the time it was published. What's distinctive about Jaynes' study is that they're driven by his concern for a particular subject, in this case, consciousness. More usually, academic research is driven by the availability of grants to study successive problems at the frontier of a particular specialty. That's the shape most academic research takes, because that's how it's financed. I suspect Jaynes' studies were not financed through grants, but driven by his personal obsession. I propose Jaynes' work as a model for how to pursue personal obsessions and for the range of activities required to satisfy them.